The Derek Bentley case is one of the most tragic and staining cases in the history of our criminal justice system.
It was the single biggest nail in the coffin of capital punishment in this country.
I never got to meet an uncle that I absolutely idolise. I miss not meeting that person.
On the evening of the 2nd of November 1952, gunshots echoed around Croydon in South London. A policeman had been killed, and 19-year-old Derek Bentley stood accused of his murder.
But he hadn't pulled the trigger. The culprit was actually Bentley's friend, Christopher Craig.
The legendary line, "Let him have it," has been immortalised on the big screen and in books. But did Bentley really utter those words? And what happened to his companion, Christopher Craig? I'm Fred Dinenage, and I've been reporting on serious crimes as a journalist for more than 40 years. It's estimated that approximately 38,000 people were murdered in Britain throughout the 20th century. I'm investigating the most notorious of these crimes to separate the fact from fiction, like the stories surrounding the infamous case of Derek Bentley.
It started as a night of petty theft involving two teenagers, but ended up with the murder of a police officer, with Derek Bentley hanging for the crime. It's now one of the most famous cases of the 20th century. He was sentenced to death without even pulling the trigger of the gun that killed PC Sidney Miles. Ultimately, this case played a significant part in the abolition of the death penalty. Derek William Bentley was born in 1933 in Blackfriars, London. He spent his early childhood growing up amongst the rubble and bombings of World War II. At the age of 4, he fell from a lorry, and it's believed this irreversibly damaged his brain, stunting his mental growth and causing epilepsy. Someone who knows all about Bentley's life and family is his niece, Maria Bentley Dingwall.
Tell me about Derek Bentley. What sort of lad he was?
Fun-loving, adored animals, absolutely. He's like, you know, straight anything go past the door, it was in the house. Really close to my mum, his sister Iris, because of his mental disabilities, his mental age. I think he was just a great guy. You know, I'm so sad I didn't really know him, but I've met him and know him through what Mum told me about him, and, you know, Nana and Grandad and the photographs and whatever else.
The war was a traumatic time for the close-knit Bentley family. 3 family members, including Derek's 13-year-old sister, were killed just 3 days into the Blitz. On one fateful night in 1944, Bentley himself was buried alive when a German incendiary bomb hit the house in Southwark. He was only 11 at the time. The constant moving of home and his medical care fragmented Bentley's education. He found school difficult and failed his 11+.
And Derek Bentley at school, did he struggle at school?
Very much so, because of his mental disability, you know, because of the fall that he had. His mental age was 8, and sometimes he just couldn't cope with the classes. So Mum used to sit with him in the classes at Norbury, and just, you know, to calm him down so he could get on with his work. But the fall just completely took everything away from him and made him not quite the way he was.
It was from this point that Bentley began to change. The once innocent boy began to get into trouble with the law.
In 1948, Bentley committed 2 minor offences, theft and attempted break-in and entering. He was then sentenced to 3 years at Kingswood Approved School, where he met educational psychologist Hugh Moore.
He was quite small and completely illiterate. He could only sign his name with a cross. He was teased a great deal, and he didn't like being teased at all. The profile that I made of him showed that he was very much a low average non-verbal IQ of 70 and was what they called in those days ESN, educationally subnormal.
Kingswood Approved School ran a strict military-style regime. Hugh Moore was popular with the pupils because he refused to carry out beatings. He was known as Slasher because of his haircut at the time.
I had to go so frequently to Mr. Adams' office,
The head teacher.
the head teacher, the principal, and witness the beatings. With Derek particularly, he was beaten for these very minor offences. And I looked so worried when I came out with him. He said to me, he said, don't worry, Slash, he said, I've got corns on my bum. It doesn't worry me at all. He said, it's no problem as far as I'm concerned.
Bentley was released from Kingswood Approved School in 1950, aged 18, and spent the next 6 months as a recluse. The world of work was to prove another hurdle.
Teenagers growing up during the war had a tough time of things. It was a case of join the military or get a job. Post-war led to greater opportunity for freedom and independence. I'm about to meet a man who at the age of 29 became the youngest prison governor in England and dealt with some of our most hardened criminals. Professor David Wilson is one of Britain's leading criminologists. England in the 1950s, after the war, if you were a teenager, what would it have been like?
After the war, being a teenager, you're thrown out of school at 15, 16, you're into the world of work. In 1939, something like 320 14 to 17-year-olds had been convicted of serious crime, murder, manslaughter, rape and robbery. But by the early 1950s, that number has quadrupled. And so people are beginning to focus on this generation of young people after the war, being anxious about what to do with them, being anxious about the kinds of crimes they're committing.
Supported by his family, the boy with the low IQ did his best to put his days of crime behind him.
Bentley has no luck throughout his life. We have to be as simple as that. After he leaves the approved school, he initially tries to get work as a furniture remover. He hurts his back, so he has to give that job up. He then works as a refuse collector. He's not able to do that. He ends up as a road sweeper. When his National Service call-out papers arrive through the letterbox, he goes along for the tests. They realize that he's functionally illiterate. He's an IQ of 66 to 77. He's got problems with his epilepsy. So this is a young man who's going nowhere fast.
Bentley's failure to be accepted into society left him frustrated. He found himself mixing with the wrong sort of company.
He fell in with the local gang that were going the rounds and doing small jobs or big jobs, and just fell in with them and went along with them, but was in no sense a leader.
When he was 18, Bentley made friends with Christopher Craig. He was 3 years younger than Bentley, and they both had the same learning difficulty. They were illiterate. Bentley quickly developed an admiration for his new friend, Craig.
Sadly, there was a person that was in the area called Christopher Craig, who had 2 boys that he would lead around like anything. One was my uncle, Derek. We tried to stop Craig coming near us, near our family. My grandfather did, by going to the police station and say, can you go and speak to the family saying we don't want him around here? He was sadly easily led because of his mental disability. You know, he was tall, he was strong, and of course Craig wanted him because Craig was just a nasty character and wanted a 6-foot softie that he could twist around his finger.
Little could the Bentleys foresee the role Christopher Craig would go on to play in their son Derek's life. 16-year-old Craig was from a respectable middle-class family and the youngest of 8. His ambition was to become a qualified gunsmith. However, on leaving school, he ended up working at a garage in Camberwell.
Christopher Craig, though, has what we would now call dyslexia. So, like Bentley, he's functionally illiterate. So people read stories to him. He's a fantasist. He likes comic books. He likes going to the cinema. And he's completely obsessed with guns. He's somebody, though, that's going to really say to Bentley, who's rather more timid and feeble, here are the kinds of things that we should be getting up to. And so that's where this kind of poisonous relationship develops between Craig and Bentley.
After the war, guns and weapons were easily accessible. Many had been left or discarded by the military. Craig had a fascination with guns and kept an arsenal of weapons in his room. He had already been convicted for possessing firearms without a license.
They carry guns because it makes them feel like a man. It makes them feel powerful. It makes them feel in control. And often, of course, these young men don't have power and control in other aspects of their lives, and carrying a gun gives them that sense of who they'd like to be. He wants to be James Cagney. That's his role model, and that's why he was so obsessed with guns, and that's why he carried a gun, because it was the only time that he felt in charge, in control, and that people wouldn't laugh at him.
It was on the 2nd of November 1952 that Derek Bentley and Christopher Craig's rebellious friendship took a sinister turn.
It would lead to the murder of a police officer and ultimately the hanging of Derek Bentley.
I'm Fred Dinenage, and I'm investigating the famous case of Derek Bentley, known, of course, for the memorable line, "Let him have it."
It would lead to the most heinous of crimes, the death of a policeman, for which Bentley would hang. What really happened that fateful night? Derek Bentley's life was to change forever on the evening of the 2nd of November 1952. He went to the Astoria cinema where his sister Iris worked, but he'd left feeling unwell. When Iris returned home, Bentley had gone out. She had no idea he'd gone to meet up with his friend and local bad boy, Christopher Craig. The teenagers were bored, restless, and out for trouble. It's thought that Bentley had no idea that his friend Craig was carrying a loaded revolver as they walked the streets of London.
Benedict Bernberg, the now retired human rights lawyer, has been described as a pioneer radical lawyer and a champion of civil liberties. His passion for justice sparked his interest in Bentley's story.
Christopher Craig, who was only 16 at the time, had a burning hatred of the police. Bill Bentley, the father of Derek, was very concerned, as was the mother, that young Derek should not have anything to do with Craig. Craig was bad news.
On a night out together, Bentley and Craig were spotted just after 9 p.m. entering Barlow and Parker's, a confectionery warehouse in Croydon.
Craig was the leading spirit in all this. And initially the idea was to break into a butcher's shop. But when they got to the butcher's shop, the light was on, so they didn't go there. Craig then went a little further down the road, Tamworth Road, just around the corner here. But there was a wholesale confectioner's factory in the road, and that was a two-story building with a flat roof at the top.
Despite their efforts to be inconspicuous, the teenagers were being watched. A lady by the name of Mrs. Ware had been looking out of her daughter's bedroom when she spotted two youths walking along the road, acting suspiciously. She noticed them because they shied away from the lights of traffic and pulled their hats over their eyes. She then watched as they jumped the gates into the yard of a private warehouse.
It was then that Mrs. Ware told her husband, who ran to the nearest phone box and called the police. No one could have predicted the events that followed.
The boys climbed their way up a drain pipe onto the flat roof of the warehouse, unaware that the police were not far behind them.
a detective constable, plainclothes officer, Fairfax, managed to get up onto the roof, followed a little later by 2 or 3 others. When Fairfax got to the roof, he saw the 2 youths, Craig and Bentley. They were huddled together near a lift shaft, which was some distance away from where Fairfax was.
DS Fairfax shouted at the boys to give themselves up, but the 2 teenagers weren't willing to come quietly.
According to the police evidence, at any rate, Craig shouted out to them, "If you want us, fucking well, come and get us."
Taking them at their word, DS Fairfax charged at the pair. He grabbed the person nearest to him, Bentley. The teenager gave himself up to the police officer, but Craig, his partner in crime, wasn't going to surrender. Instead, he pulled out the revolver that he'd been concealing. What resulted was a tense standoff between him and the police. Years later, what happened on the roof is still subject to much debate.
Some of the statements that are later made by Bentley in court and the police don't correspond. But seemingly, according to the police, what happens at that point is that Sergeant Fairfax, who's pushing Bentley forward because Craig's obviously got a gun, at which point it's alleged by the 3 police officers that Bentley says, "Let him have it, Chris."
Allegedly, those words were to start a chain of events that would leave 1 policeman injured and another dead. Christopher Craig began firing and DS Fairfax was shot in the shoulder. Craig had been only 6 feet away. Fairfax then grabbed hold of Bentley and used him as a human shield.
Now, this is really crucial, Fred. "Let him have it, Chris," is clearly an ambiguous statement which might imply that Bentley is inciting Craig to fire at the police, albeit it could also be interpreted as, "Give your gun to the police officer." Now, this is going to be crucial at the trial.
Derek Bentley was arrested while Christopher Craig was holding back the police with his loaded revolver. Soon, armed reinforcements were on hand. Uniformed police officer Sidney George Miles took the lead. As he burst onto the rooftop, Craig fired off another round. The bullet struck PC Sidney Miles between the eyes, killing him instantly. Christopher Craig had murdered a police officer. The sad irony was that the victim was not a stranger to Bentley and Craig.
Sidney Miles was a friend of our family. He was our local peace officer and he knew how we felt about Christopher Craig. We'd actually been speaking to Sidney about, what can we do about Christopher Craig and how can we stop this from happening, and, that he's a nasty boy, he's got guns, and, the whole neighbourhood were trying to sort this situation out with Craig.
PC Sidney Miles' death didn't stop Christopher Craig. A gunfight broke out between Craig and the wounded DS Fairfax. Fairfax, now armed with a revolver, ordered Craig to drop the gun. Both fired shots. Fairfax fired twice and then rushed at Craig. Craig fired, but no shots came. "See," he yelled, "it's empty." Craig then turned and jumped off the roof. The shooting had lasted 20 minutes, but the drama didn't stop there. Craig fell over 20 feet, landing on a greenhouse. He fractured his spine and left forearm and broke his breastbone. Unable to move, he was arrested. Derek Bentley, who'd been held by the police during the shootout, was taken to the station for questioning.
Well, he would have been very frightened about the whole thing. Being of such low intelligence, he would not clearly have understood what was going on.
Whilst going to the police station, it's alleged by the police that Bentley says, "He had a gun, I told him not to use it, he's killed one of your blokes," and so forth and so forth. Everything that would suggest that he knew that Craig had gone armed on the breaking and entering.
Bentley's family had no idea of the events their son had been involved in that evening.
Mum had stayed up late that night because Derek had gone out with his friend. Next thing, the doorbell went and police came in and said that that Derek's been arrested for murder. And it wasn't until afterwards that we learnt from the police that it wasn't Derek that shot a police officer. So we had to wait for a journalist to tell us this information.
After hours of questioning, Derek Bentley signed a statement. In it, he denied all knowledge of Craig having a gun and took no responsibility for the murder of PC Miles. Nevertheless, he was charged with murder alongside Christopher Craig.
I don't like painting him lily white. I've always said that if they've charged him with being on private property and attempted burglary, then that would have been a fair assessment of what happened that night.
Given the fact he is a moral reasoning of a 4-year-old, Derek Bentley probably didn't even understand a word that they were claiming that he had just signed his name to. And of course, that statement, signed, albeit misspelled, is going to again be one of the key prosecution items in the court case.
Bentley and Craig's visit to the confectionery warehouse had turned sour. One policeman injured, another dead. Craig's Al Capone fantasies had come to life. But this was Croydon, not Hollywood. It wasn't going to have a glamorous ending.
And it would be Derek Bentley who would end up paying the ultimate price for the crime.
I'm Fred Dinenage, and I'm investigating one of the most controversial cases in British legal history, that of Derek Bentley and Christopher Craig. One policeman injured, another dead.
What started out as a petty theft had turned into a deadly shootout. Bentley and Craig had to face the consequences of their actions, and it would lead to one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in the 20th century. On the evening of November the 2nd, 1952, Christopher Craig had shot dead PC Sidney Miles on a rooftop of a Croydon warehouse. Both he and his accomplice, Derek Bentley, were arrested and charged with murder. But just how guilty was Bentley?
How could he be charged with murder, though, when he wasn't the one who fired the shot?
Well, here's one of those peculiarities of English law. If Bentley knows that Christopher Craig is carrying a gun and is aware of that fact, he is an accomplice, even though he himself didn't carry a gun. But it gets worse than that. The prosecution was able to prove through that phrase, "let him have it, Chris," that there was incitement. So not only was he, Bentley, an accomplice, he, according to the prosecution, incites Craig to fire the weapon, which is going to lead to one police officer being killed, another police officer being shot. So in the eyes of English law, he's just as guilty as Craig, even though he wasn't actually carrying the weapon, and indeed was under arrest at the time that the police constable was killed.
On the 9th of December 1952, just 1 month after the murder of PC Miles, Derek Bentley and Christopher Craig stood trial for murder at the Old Bailey. They both pleaded not guilty. The punishment for murder was hanging. However, at just 16, the gunman, Craig, could only face imprisonment because of his age. But for Bentley, aged 19, a guilty verdict would mean death.
It is the doctrine of a joint enterprise. The law at the time, and indeed in a sense still is that if 2 or more people go on an expedition to commit a serious offence, a felony, and go intending to resist arrest by force, and somebody is killed in the process as a homicide, then they are both equally responsible for the actions, even though one of them may not have been responsible for the death.
When the family realised that he was being charged with murder, even though he'd not fired the shot himself, what was the reaction?
Well, we've got great British justice. He'll be proved innocent in court.
The trial lasted 2.5 days. Derek Bentley's defence lawyers gave no opening speech, and no one other than Bentley was called to the stand to give evidence on his behalf.
We didn't have money. We couldn't afford a private solicitor like the Craigs could. We had state representation, and the state representation didn't want to anger the judge.
His own counsel took the view that he ought to have hanged. And if your own counsel feels that, there's not much inclination to defend a person like that. That in itself was one of the great shortcomings.
Nanny and Grandad weren't allowed to give evidence regarding his state of mind, and what sort of person he was like either. None of this was allowed to happen. In a 2.5-day trial, they wanted one conviction and one conviction only, and that was of guilty.
The prosecution's aim was to prove that on the night of the murder, Bentley knew Craig was carrying a gun, and furthermore, that he'd encouraged him to shoot by shouting the infamous words, "Let him have it," therefore making Bentley complicit of the crime and guilty of murder. The statements Bentley gave during his arrest were used against him in the trial. Years later, it's believed these statements may not have been the exact words of Bentley, a man with an estimated mental age of 8. Dr. John Olson is one of the leading experts in forensic linguistics.
John, forensic linguistics. Explain, please.
Forensic linguistics is where language interfaces with the law. It has been very important, especially in cases like Derek Bentley, Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4. A number of analyses have been done of statements which were supposed to have been produced by suspects or witnesses, and some of them have turned out to be, in some respects, somewhat suspect.
In court, Bentley denied knowing that Craig had a gun. However, in his statement to the police, Bentley appears to indicate that his accomplice was armed on the night of the killing.
His first reference to the gun is as a definite article, so he says, "I did not know he was going to use the gun." And it would appear that he said that completely spontaneously. So first of all, it's a spontaneous negative, "I did not know." And second of all, no reference to the gun up until now, so why not a gun? But instead we have the gun. The point about statements at that time was that they were supposed to be taken according to judges' rules. They were supposed to be dictated. And in fact, the police officers giving evidence at Bentley's trial stated that he had just simply dictated it to them, which I believe to be completely impossible. I think you have to be reasonably literate to be able to dictate.
In the early 1950s, there would be heightened passions. A police officer's been killed. The police would be wanting to arrest somebody for it. They'd be fully aware that Christopher Craig was only 16. Derek Bentley was therefore the culpable one. We've got a young man, a feeble-minded young man, effectively being verbaled, signing his name, D-E-R-K, and signing, effectively, his death warrant.
The crux of Bentley's defence was that when the fatal shot was fired, he'd been under arrest. But when questioned, he appeared to contradict this, revealing that he'd been free and in a position to run away at any time. He believed it would help his cause if the jury learned that he'd stayed with the police by his own volition. Bentley didn't understand that being under arrest no longer made him an accomplice.
What the trial didn't disclose is that if there's a joint enterprise, it's an agreement which can be terminated, and it had terminated before the shot was fired at PC Miles. That shot was not fired until about 15 minutes after Bentley had been detained. So he was arrested. He was under arrest at the time and had been for about 15 minutes when PC Miles was shot.
When someone like Bentley, who is illiterate, takes the stand, how confusing is it for them?
Incredibly difficult, because barristers, when they are examining somebody or cross-examining somebody, they're not interested in the truth. They're interested in a version of events. So the prosecution has a narrative. of the whole crime. They want to put that narrative to the jury. They're going to be focusing on questions which give them the correct answers to put that narrative over. Here, the narrative was very well established by the statement and, of course, by the fact that Bentley, as you say, made such a poor witness. He was really unable to answer questions in a satisfactory way. He contradicted himself. He appeared to be untruthful and deceitful, which may not have been the case at all. He just simply wasn't able to put his point over very well indeed.
The most damning evidence in the trial came from the 3 police officers who'd all been on the roof at that time. They stated that just before Craig started firing, Bentley had shouted out, "Let him have it, Chris."
Both lads denied that those words were ever said. And it's very curious, as those words was also used in an earlier case about 12 years before, where a police officer had been killed in a rather similar event. And the suggestion is that they simply lifted the words from that earlier case and used them as a way to ensure that Bentley went down.
He always said, when he was asked by my grandfather, "Did you say those words?" And he said, "No, Father, I didn't, never did." And there's one trait that we have in the Bentley family: we can't lie. It's just something that isn't in us. So Derek never could tell lies anyway. It was like he just wasn't able to.
Lord Chief Justice Rayner Goddard summed up the trial by asking the jury if they considered the police to be conspicuous liars willing to lie away the life of a young boy.
The judge had talked rhetorically about these brave police officers who would have fabricated evidence against someone. He was inflaming the jury to convict.
On the 11th of December 1952, the jury took just 75 minutes to decide that both Derek Bentley and Christopher Craig were guilty for the murder of PC Sidney Miles. Craig, at 16, was too young to hang. Bentley was 19 and therefore sentenced to death.
With Bentley found guilty of murder, the judge had no choice but to send him to the gallows. Still, Maria believes the judge had been biased against her uncle.
Lord Chief Justice Goddard just went for the full sentence of the death penalty because he wanted an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That was, they couldn't get the boy that did the murder, so they got the next best thing, my uncle.
I'm Fred Dinenage, and I'm investigating one of the 20th century's most contentious murders. In 1952, PC Sidney Miles had been killed in a shootout on a warehouse roof in Croydon. Derek Bentley and Christopher Craig had been found guilty of his murder.
The gunman, Craig, had escaped the noose because he was only 16. But 19-year-old Derek Bentley had been sentenced to death. On the 11th of December 1952, inside a packed Old Bailey, Lord Chief Justice Goddard told Christopher Craig he was the more guilty of the 2 teenagers. The judge sentenced Craig to 10 years, naming him as one of the most dangerous criminals in Britain.
When that verdict was announced and the death penalty was announced, what was the reaction of the family?
Disbelief. How could this happen? Derek hadn't shot anybody. He was under arrest for 15 minutes before the fatal shot was fired. His part in any action that night had finished, had ended. So how could this be right?
Even after the sentencing by Lord Chief Justice Goddard, the Bentley family hoped for a reprieve. His case was presented to the Court of Appeal on the 13th of January 1953, but it was quickly dismissed. The sentence of death remained, but the 19-year-old's plight was gaining national attention in the media. Protest marches began in support of Derek Bentley.
There are petitions in the country, the newspapers are on back of the case, and one of my personal heroines, Mrs. Elsie van der Elst, who's a real character, a real death penalty, anti-death penalty campaigner, is banging on the doors, banging on the gates of Wandsworth Prison, demanding to be let in to see the governor to protect this boy who she says is going to be murdered by the state.
Did the family visit Derek when he was in prison?
As much as they could. I think it was mostly every day. Mama, Nana, Grandad. And he would ask how about the doggies, how Judy is, and how the cats and other chickens behaving themselves. It was, you know, just things to keep him normal. There was a big, thick screen of glass between them. And, you know, my mother was most frustrated over it. And all she wanted to do was grab a chair and break that screen so she could just hug her brother. And she always regret not breaking that glass to the day she died.
Bentley's final hope of avoiding execution lay with the Home Secretary, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. Fyfe could advise the sovereign to exercise the royal prerogative of mercy, changing a sentence of death by hanging to one of lifetime imprisonment.
In the first half of the 20th century, reprieves were common. 3 out of 4 people who were recommended mercy by the jury had their death penalty quashed in favour of a life sentence.
The Home Secretary saw in allowing the execution of Derek Bentley a way of sending out a message to other young people who might be convinced that they would be able to get away with committing this type of crime.
The appeals failed, no reprieve came. At 9 a.m. on the 28th of January 1953, a crowd of around 500 gathered outside Wandsworth Prison and sang "The Lord is my shepherd and abide with me." Derek William Bentley, aged just 19, had been hanged.
Mum was always said that there was a clock on the mantelpiece in the sitting room, and it struck 9 o'clock, and Nanny just collapsed because someone had just killed her son. From a young, vibrant Nan, from pictures I've got of her, she aged 50 years in a matter of moments.
Derek Bentley was hanged for a murder he didn't physically commit. He was the first and only person in the 20th century to be executed in Britain for being an accomplice. After serving 10 years imprisonment, Christopher Craig was released in 1963 to start a new life. Many believe this case was one of the contributing factors that led to the permanent abolition of the death penalty in 1969.
It was highly significant because the abhorrence that people felt at what had happened to this poor lad was the single biggest factor in securing the abolition of hanging in this country.
But this was of no consequence to Bentley's family. Led by Derek's dad Bill and Derek's sister Iris, a group was formed to clear his name.
It was run from the back room of a 3-bedroom semi-detached house, and it was Mama and my grandfather that were the 2 staunch bull elephants that would, you know, rally everybody around. Journalists would ring us up, or we think we might have another lead, or we'd ring up yourselves, and they would come out and do a story on it and see if we can get it into the Home Office. So it took over the house, the lives of my family.
I first got involved, I think, for the Bentleys in the 1970s or thereabouts. I had always been determined ultimately to take up Derek's case, which I thought was a gross miscarriage of justice.
After 40 years of work and numerous appeals, Iris Bentley and her legal team made their first breakthrough.
In July 1993, Derek Bentley received a royal posthumous pardon for the sentence of death passed upon him. However, under English law, this did not overturn his conviction for murder.
The law still recognised that Bentley was guilty of the killing of PC Sidney Miles.
I myself wanted more than a pardon. I wanted to show that, in fact, Derek had been wrongly convicted in the first place, that he, in fact, was an innocent man who didn't need a pardon because he was innocent. He should never have been convicted.
It was like bashing your head against a brick wall. They just didn't want to admit that they were wrong, that they'd done this awful, horrific crime to a person that was under arrest for 15 minutes and only had a mental age of 8.
New evidence was brought forward to support the legal battle for a pardon. One of the main flaws of the case involved Bentley's statements, which may not have been his own words.
When you look at Derek Bentley's statements, can you tell how those statements were put together?
That's a very interesting question and quite a complex question. It's evident that some of it was put together as a result of question and answer. So we have a sequence where he says, there was a little iron gate at the side, full stop. Chris then jumped over and I followed, full stop. Up to then, Chris had not said anything, full stop. Very short sentences. This indicates to me, and to other linguists who've looked at this, that very likely this was from a series of questions. So what did you do when you got there? Well, Chris looked in the window. Okay, and what did he see? There was an iron gate at the side. If this isn't his spontaneous language, then courts cannot depend on this as being his version of events. In that case, a jury would not be entitled to find such a person guilty.
The Bentley family's fight for justice also uncovered new witnesses. One was a police officer who was on the roof on the night of the shooting. He denied that Derek Bentley had ever shouted, "Let him have it, Chris." His statement hadn't been read out at the original court case, and his police notebook vanished from the evidence.
On the 30th of July 1998, more than 4 decades after Derek Bentley's death, the Court of Appeal quashed the murder conviction. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Bingham, criticised the original judge's summation, saying the trial was such as to deny the appellant that fair trial, which is the birthright of every British citizen. And do you remember, obviously you do, the day when the acquittal came through?
I felt justified in my actions. We'd achieved what Iris had always set out to achieve, to get her brother's name cleared. It was a terrific sense of elation. But of course, it was a great day for British justice too.
Despite Iris Bentley's 44-year battle to clear her brother's name, she was never to hear the final decision. Iris died in January 1997.
I had to remember to take the bottle of champagne out of the fridge that my grandfather had bought in 1952 because we were going to win the appeal, and we didn't, so he kept it. And I was the one that opened it on behalf of the rest of my family on that morning. Beautiful sunshine. And you may not have seen them on camera, but they were there with us, Derek, Mum, Nanny, the whole family, to celebrate justice.
Derek Bentley's execution raised questions about how we ensure fair trials and sentencing.
And it started people thinking about it, not just in the House of Commons, but everyday people, that it could happen to anybody, that if your child had a disability or whatever else, or was just in the wrong place, and the government didn't want to listen to your arguments, then you've had it. You've got no comeback.
People know what's fair, people know what's just, people know what's right, and the execution of Derek Bentley was neither fair, just or right.
The events of the 2nd of November 1952 are tragic and led to the hanging of an innocent man.
But of course we have to remember, it wasn't just Derek Bentley who suffered. PC Sidney Miles was shot and killed in the most tragic of circumstances. So the case begs the question, how do we make sure the punishment fits the crime?